of all the guests over the last 12 years, I've had the privilege of working with these Beatle conventions in, as Mark mentioned, in New York, Los Angeles and Boston, 1 year San Francisco, Florida. Didn't we do Orlando? I think we did Orlando. Oh my God, the other person who was at Orlando, thank you. But of all the guests we've had in those many, many conventions, I think in the book it says something about I've done about 28 of these or something like that. No idea it'd be that many. I don't think there's been a guest we've had who's had closer friendship, connection with, and who's been an associate of the Beatles musically and an equal peer to them, and a dear, dear friend of mine too. Please welcome the one and only Donovan.
Okay. Hello. Hello. Oh yeah.
Just a little wake-up call for those who hadn't woken up yet. So, as usual, we'll do this without a safety net. We haven't planned anything. We'll just natter away.
Why not?
As we do. So, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are the vast majority of you those from the United States or Canada? How many of you by sound are from the United Kingdom? John, we're surrounded.
There's one.
Well, one or two.
There's one.
Therefore, I think it might be instructive to go back a little bit in time to the 50s, because the birth of the music that you created, that the Beatles created, was in the Britain of the late 40s and 50s, and how the influences were, and what Britain was like, because Britain was not the modern country with 25 TV channels and millions of radio channels and everything. Can you remind us a little bit of what Britain was like in those early days?
Well, you know, Britain covers quite a few ancient countries, as you know, and I'm from Scotland, and Scotland is also considered under the British flag, because in the British flag are various flags, aren't there? There is the Welsh flag, there is the Scottish flag, and there's the British flag. The Union Jack is made up of these three countries. So imagine, well, 4 countries if you want to include Cornwall. Cornwall also has its nationalistic spirit recently. So, I come from Scotland. You're talking about the late 40s, because that's me.
Late 40s and 50s.
And then the 50s, yeah.
Like, what it was like.
Well, there was Frank Sinatra on the radio, and Bing Crosby, and my mother and father were obviously of that generation. The big band music was very hot. On the radio, I was listening to that mysterious radio show, Journey into Space. Do you remember that one? And in Scotland, my mother and father would play me their records. They were old, hard 78s. And I listened to the music of Scotland at first at the parties that my mother and father would have at New Year's Eve and at weddings and at birthdays. New Year's Eve in Scotland is called Hogmanay. And it was an excuse to do quite a lot of drinking and quite a lot of singing, and sometimes quite a lot of fighting too. So imagine I grew up in a port city, just like the Beatles grew up in the Liverpool port, which they called the Pool. I grew up in Glasgow. And there, on the banks of the Clyde in Scotland, was where all the great ships were made, those great ocean liners, the QE2, which Martin and I made a crossing on, this historic ship made in the shipyards of Glasgow. So I was born into a city that was full of sailors and great shipping tales and stories. And of course the Beatles also grew up in a port city. So into the ports come the ships, and into Liverpool, as is pointed out in that wonderful book of Brian Epstein, which you recently helped to re-release, which is called
Cellar Full of Noise.
A Cellar Full of Noise. Into the great ports of Britain came American music, and of course, some of the rarest music was heard by the very early lovers of music like myself and the Beatles. So, growing up in Glasgow, listening to the songs of Scotland and Ireland must have been like the Beatles too, growing up in Liverpool, so closely connected to Dublin, and of course Lennon and McCartney are Irish names. And so the influence of the singer-songwriter, the lover of poetry, and the storyteller, it arrived in Glasgow too, from old Ireland, and it arrived in Liverpool. By the time I was listening to records, it was my mother and father's records. We moved down in the mid-50s in 1955. You might say it was a black and white world. The newsreels, the black and white movies, the explosion of youth culture had already begun in the late 40s and early 50s, with not mods and rockers, but teddy boys. And by 1955, there was a movie from America which was enlightening everybody called Rock Around the Clock. Now, if you don't know this movie, it was very exuberant. Bill Haley and his Comets, and it possibly was the first pop success, huge success of this new youth culture. But I was also brought up with folk song, and I listened to the Scottish and Irish songs that my parents used to sing, and so I brought that with me. 1955, I arrived in the south of England, Scottish in England, and we lived in a town called Hatfield within the great satellite roads that went around the city of London. And in 1955, I was 10 years old. Maybe too young to be listening to Bill Haley and the Comets, but I was also listening to my father's records of Billie Holiday, Frank Sinatra, My Fair Lady, the musicals. So I was absorbing a lot of pop culture too. By 1958, things had changed forever, as you know.
They did, and one of the things that was interesting was that I don't even think the word teenager was much used until the 50s. You were a young, growing adult, prospective adult, I guess, until suddenly you became 21 or 22 and you were a grown-up. But the rock and roll culture, particularly coming from America, defined that there were a thing called teenagers, and there were music coming from people like obviously Elvis and Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers, and some of that music had really touched you especially, didn't it?
Yes, you could say I was too young for Elvis, but of course later I realized where he came from and what he was and what he meant. So my 3 years younger than the Beatles, me, 3 years younger than Dylan. I was the second British invasion because of the youth I felt. I was the younger brother. I kind of picked up on the Everly Brothers, so I arrived at the puberty age of 13 and 14, listening to the heavenly harmonies of the Everly Brothers, which of course influenced the Beatles so much.
Do you think it's a touch of a flavour of some of that early music that you were listening to at that time? Maybe on the guitar?
Yes. Remember how you used to be loved, and now I see them slip away. It breaks my heart to see us part. So sad to watch good love go bad. Is it any wonder why I feel so blue? I can't do the harmonies when I know for certain that I'm losing you. Oh, God. But yeah.
And then, as you grew a little older and hit 15, 16, a wandering moment caught your eye and you got the urge to wander.
Yeah, you see, I thought I'd left pop music behind. As soon as I arrived at the ages 15 in Britain, okay, this black and white world, which was about to explode in about 66 into full color, was still black and white in the late 50s and early 60s. Imagine it. And so I was listening to pop music as a young man growing up and falling in love with school friends and falling in love with Julie Christie in the movie Billy Liar, another black and white movie of the classic age of British angry young men movies. And so I had my eyes now set on a bohemian world. And from the age of 15 to 16 in Britain in those days, that was it. At 15, if you didn't have any passes in your school, A levels or B levels or C levels, you went to work. You got a longer school life here. So, if you managed to get into a college of further education, you did so. And mine was the campus in Welwyn Garden City called Further Education, Welwyn Garden City College of Further Education. So my further education plugged me straight into the world of Bohemia at the ages 15 and a half. And so there I was. I was introduced to jazz and blues and folk and pottery and modern art and philosophy, and the teachers that I loved the most were the pottery teachers, of course, the art school teacher, and the teacher of English literature. Now my father, I forgot to add, brought me up reading me poetry from a very early age, and the power of Beatles lyrics and the power of their songwriting, I have this too, because we come from a tradition of Irish, Scottish, Celtic background where we were always very well read and very well taught with music, and poetry is very much a part of the Scottish and Irish family community life. Many books on the shelves, even 200 years ago. I mean, this was a very literate society, the Irish and the Scots. So here I am in the Bohemian college, and I'm feeling very good now. I'm leaving pop music behind, so I thought. And what was I doing? I was absorbing the incredible movements that were happening in the folk world. Little did I know that I was part of that folk world anyway, but when I was listening to Joan Baez, Woody Guthrie, and Pete Seeger, I was being informed, and I started to get the feeling that this music should be heard by my whole generation, and that world of the teenager that Martin was speaking of was the baby boom. After the Second World War, an enormous amount of young people were born, including me. And as we were born, we entered a world where the teenager was becoming more powerful, being able to buy the small plastic pop record, which I would soon be part of. But before that time, I absorbed this bohemian lifestyle, and one book, Jack Kerouac, On the Road, and a few songs of Woody Guthrie gave me the wanderlust. And so I hitchhiked away from home. I left the college behind. I didn't go to art school in the end, and I found a guitar and hitchhiked down the road to seek my fortune and join this great movement of youth in the early 60s to try to bring some understanding and meaning to this post-war world which had a nuclear cloud just sitting above us in the future.
Indeed. Beautifully put. I think we're reacting to that. Nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over us, and we forget that those were the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fear that there could be a nuclear war at any moment.
And the Vietnam War was raging. This was not part of our upbringing in Britain. It was part of your upbringing here in America, and it was very present for you. But it was also very present for us as a young generation of thinkers and great heartfelt longing to change the world.
And there you are, you're in St Ives and in the Duchy of Cornwall, never a separate nation, or not recently a separate nation, but a duchy, the Duchy of Cornwall. And is it Where is it when you first encounter the music of the Beatles that tells you that popular music has something to offer?
Well, there I am, and I've got a guitar. I'm sleeping on the beaches, and I went down in that summer of 62 and 63 was the big summer. And when I went down, I followed lots of young people from the art schools and the campuses of the north of Britain to spend the summer on the beaches. And I worked in the harbour bar, and my job is affectionately called a pearl diver. I was a pearl diver, and this is a very sweet way of describing dishwasher. So I was bringing the plates in, and I was really good at it, and the harbour bar was selling the burgers and the coffees, the frothy coffee, and there was a cardboard wall between me and the main room, and through that cardboard wall was a jukebox, and it was bouncing out the songs of the day, the hit records, and especially the Beatles. But it kind of washed over me. I didn't connect the Beatles with the Everleys or Buddy Holly yet. And anyway, I'd left pop music behind. And so I was absorbing every folk song I could and listening and learning the whole catalogue of the Joan Baez records. And I had bought a guitar. Well, I'd swapped my boots for this guitar. And God knows whether I walked around barefoot, I can't remember. But it was summer, so maybe I walked around barefoot. And I learned all these songs, and I listened to the records and picked. And so I was really absorbing at a great rate every folk song that I could learn that summer.
Could you give us a flavour of just a touch of one of those folk songs that was coming in?
Well, Woody Guthrie's I've been hitting some hard traveling, I thought you know. I've been hitting some hard traveling way down the road. I've been hitting some hard traveling, hard drinking, hard gambling. I've been hitting some hard traveling, Lord. And of course there were others which were really more to me, meant more to me than the traveling songs. Written by Buffy Sainte-Marie, the Canadian-American Indian girl who wrote this extraordinary song. He's 5'2" and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from here and there, and you and me, and brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put the end to war. Yeah, Buffy. But you were saying how I got introduced to this Beatle event that was happening. You were.
Indeed.
Well, when that summer was over, I went home, and my mother was pleased to see me. She said, "You look awfully thin, son," and she started to feed me. But I was young and I liked to be thin. But I ate, and she was at work one day, and so was my father, and I felt displaced being back in the house after having left. I broke my parents' hearts. I started leaving home really early. I think Dylan did too. But they'd bring me back. Sometimes the police would bring me back. I might be 12 and a half or 13. I just knew that I had to move. I had to get going and out of this working class background, and a working class hero is definitely something to be. But I didn't know where that was taking me. And when I went home, I went up to my bedroom and I saw the remnants of my school days, pieces of art that I'd drawn, an old sculpture in sculpture class, photographs of the Paris Bohemian scene in the late 50s, the dreams that I dreamt when I was a young teenager. And as I came down the stairs of the Axminster carpet stairs, back down in the working class, 2 up, 2 down, new little boxes on the hillside, as Pete Seeger used to sing, little boxes on the hillside, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky little boxes on the hillside, and they all look just the same. There's a red one, there's a yellow one. That was what I lived in after Glasgow. And I'm coming down the little box staircase, and on the radio there's a song. And I only remember this experience after the event, what happened to me when I was writing pages of my book, which I'm doing now. I started to remember what happened as I walked down that staircase, and there was a song on the radio, and there was two guitars, and there was one voice, two voices, two guitars, a harmonica, a bass, and drums. And the little Bakelite radio of the day was a 1950s job, like the great 50s grills on the cars of America. And out of this little Bakelite radio came this song, and it stunned me. And I sat down on the stairs, and I went into an altered state. I know what that means now. And somehow time stopped, and out of the radio came, love, love me do, you know I love you, I'll always be true, so please love me do, oh yeah, love me do. And I went, shh. I didn't know who it was. I said, that's it, I'm going to do that. Now I didn't know what that was or what it meant. Then the DJ came on the radio and said, that was Love Me Do by the Beatles. And so, not only did I have my eyes and my heart set in one direct line to meet Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, somewhere in me, I wasn't developed yet, I had to meet those guys, because what they were doing was amazing. There was now a door opened, incredibly, that would mix the world of folk, and the world of the blues, and the world of pop music, and through that door could rush all the Bohemian ideas of change that the folk world wanted to bring to the world of popular culture. Well done, Beatles.
Now, there are two ways to meet people who we admire. One is you have the chance encounter after a gig or something like that, and you go up and they have no idea who you are, and you say, pleased to meet you and I'm a big fan. And that's a nice way to do it. But you were fortunate enough to have another way, because you started to achieve some things in your own right.
Well, many people meet the great movers and shakers from the outside in. You're quite right. And I met the Beatles from the inside out. Already we had a connection. Already I felt the connection with this one song. But I was yet to see the true connection. I immersed myself in the new invasions of Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, and of course Bob Dylan, as these records came over from America and washed across the Bohemian world in Britain. We knew something was happening, and I knew I was part of it. So I met Buffy Sainte-Marie through Daryl Adams, a banjo picker who played with Ramblin' Jack Elliott. Ramblin' Jack Elliott was a disciple of Woody Guthrie. You know of that name, I'm thinking. And of course, Dylan was a disciple of Woody Guthrie, and I was far removed, never having met Woody, but I was also his disciple. So I knew of Jack Elliott, but I met Daryl Adams, so he was a direct connection to the American folk revival. Through Daryl I met Buffy, through Buffy I met Joan Baez, and followed her. That spring of 1965, I followed her concerts. I was introduced to her. She knew that I was a new face on the scene. She introduced me to Pete Seeger on the telephone, and I was invited to play at Newport Folk Festival. But that particular spring, Dylan came over, and he was releasing his first single. Folk musicians, jazz musicians didn't release singles, you see. They released albums. But here was Bob's first single, and it was Times Are Changing. Here was Joan Baez's first single, There But For Fortune, and I had already had 2 singles, Catch the Wind and Colors, on the charts. And one of them goes like this. In the chilly hours and minutes of uncertainty, I want to be in the warm hug of your loving mind. For to feel you all around me and to take your hand along the sand. Can you sing? Ah, but I may as well try and catch the wind. Yeah, thank you. So I went up to Joan Baez's suite in the Savoy Hotel, and she was really giving out about Bob. Bob was this, Bob was that. They were the king and queen of folk music, and they'd had a wild affair for 2 years, not married, but they definitely had this incredible relationship, and now it was over. And here comes little old me. And in a way, I get a bit sweet on Joni, because she looks, my God, this is an angel, and it sings as well. But I'd never heard so much rough language coming out of an angel before. That, Dylan, that, and her mother was there. And her mother and father were interesting. She grew up in a very radical family, really. And that's another story. But anyway, she's giving out how Bob is not going to come down to the march in Trafalgar Square, which was obviously against the nuclear bomb. And he just refused. He'd given up protest. And so I walked into this atmosphere in the Savoy Hotel, and Joni was really giving out. And so I said, well, I'll come down. She went, okay. So I accompanied her to that march that week. But more importantly for my story, she said, I'll introduce you to Bobby. And so she did. And a movie was being made that week of Bob's arrival in Britain. And he had a tour, and Joni had a tour, and I had a tour, and all of us were on the charts. And the whole country that spring was talking about the folk rock revival. And this element that was going to enter pop music, meaningful lyrics, committed intentions of changing the world, and the frivolous songs of the pop world would soon be infiltrated with this new meaning, which was all our intention and what we wanted to do. So during the filming of Don't Look Back, many events happened that you didn't see on the film. For instance, Allen Ginsberg, the poet, was there those 2 weeks and hanging out at the Savoy with Bob and I. And Allen and I, when we started writing out the lyrics of Subterranean Homesick Blues, which Bobby would throw in his video as he would sing his first video, I guess it was his first video, Bobby saw me doing the lettering with Allen. He said, hey, Donovan, you do the lyrics. They look good. And so he was very caustic, and I was being compared to him, and it was a very tough sort of thing for a young man to come in. But Joni said, hey, this kid's got spunk. He's just moved straight in. And I just moved straight in. I needed to know these guys. I needed to know Bob. And so, the end of the tours, the end of the hullabaloo, the film was completed, and one last night Bob was going to spend in the Savoy Hotel, and I went down to say goodbye. And I was still in my rags and tatters, 2 hit records, and still sleeping on people's floors. And that's how I lived then. I was still the gypsy. I hadn't got a flat, or a place to live, or even a hotel. But I went down to this Savoy hotel, and I went across the Persian carpets, picked up the phone. The porters in the Savoy hotel, this is a very swish establishment hotel, and they were used to me by then. And of course, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez had been in it for 2 weeks in film crews, and so they were kind of used to it. And they saw me and they said, "Good evening, Donovan." And I picked up the phone, and it was Bob Nurth, Dylan's tour manager, and everybody in Dylan's entourage sounded like him. "Hey, Donovan, it's Bobby Nurth." I said, "Hello, Bob, can I come? I want to say goodbye." And Bob's leaving tomorrow. "Okay, come on up." So I went up, knocked on the door opened, the suite overlooking the Thames, a beautiful suite, and there's the great river flowing below. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and Nurth led me along a corridor of a suite so very different from the last 2 weeks. It was now quiet and peaceful, although I'd spent some evenings like that with Bob. And I walked along the corridor, and Nurth said, "Bobby's in the TV room, go on in." So I went into the TV room, and it was black, except for the screen of the TV, and I saw the shadowy figure of little Bob in a big sofa, and I sat cross-legged on the floor, and we watched the TV. And Bobby said, "Yeah, come in, Don, sit down." And as we watched the TV, I remember now that I'd had one of these big English joints before I arrived, and I was feeling really mellow. And we were watching television, and on television I remember there was a ice skating championship. A pretty young girl in a miniskirt making circles on the ice with her skates. Very soon British television would close down. In those days, a little bit of social history. In those days, British television stopped at 12 o'clock on the dot, and a priest would come on to say the evening prayer, and then it would be darkness. Hard to imagine now. But as we're watching this ice skating show, I've become aware of other figures in the room, shadowy figures, maybe two on a sofa and another in a big armchair. And one of the nearest shadows leaned over to me and said, "Hello, Donovan, how are you?" And the accent was unmistakable. It was just unmistakable. And Bobby stood up, turned the television off, flipped on the lights and said, "Have you met these guys?" And there they were, the 4 Beatles. And that's how I met those guys.
And of course, it's a lovely tribute to that you'd achieved in just 2 singles, that they knew who you were.
Well, George stood up and he looked at me and he said, "Would you like a lift?" And so George was the first contact immediately, and he meant, would I like a ride home? I couldn't tell him I didn't have a home. I just needed to be driven around to Putney, where I was sleeping on the floor. But anyway, Bob introduced me, and I'm forever grateful, because here I was, focusing 17 months earlier on an intention, and I believed I had something to add to this great change in music that was coming. I felt it. And then George said later, "You felt out of your depth that night, didn't you, Don?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But you weren't, you know. You were just like us, and you are." And so I was accepted into that extraordinary event, and those events I would call Bob Dylan and the Beatles. Their actual meeting was very, very important as well.
Indeed, and as you say, that the paths, the tributaries of that river of music that had at some time become separated, started to flow back. The tributaries were coming back into one big river where the folk and the blues and the jazz and all the other elements could share together. And that evolved. Talk a bit about that, because it wasn't just yourself and Dylan and the Beatles, but others were also starting to bring this social consciousness into music.
Well, you're quite right, Martin. The roots of pop music are folk and jazz and blues. When you listen to Elvis's first record now, it's a double bass and guitar, isn't it? I mean, and he listened to roots music. When you listen to Buddy Holly, you hear the kind of a little bit of Latin, because he was on the border of Mexico down there, wasn't he? And you hear the country music, or what you call the folk music of the poor working white class. That comes in there. When you hear the Everly Brothers, it's extraordinary that they've got Irish grannies and they learned all the Irish folk songs. And other bands in Britain, especially in the rhythm and blues revival, up and down the country in Britain, every major city had a jazz club, and every Wednesday they started introducing a rhythm and blues night. And we all know now the white boys from Britain who formed these rhythm and blues groups, the Rolling Stones probably being the most extraordinary event. But up in Newcastle, the Animals, and in Manchester, the Hollies, and all over the country, and the Kinks down in London there, with a kind of an irreverent mixture of roots music and pop culture. And this meaningful sound, this committed lyric, I also tied up in my mind that radio was not playing meaningful, committed lyrics. These were radical events. When you marched in the street, as you've seen in the history, television history, the police were there with dogs and with horses and with batons. So free speech, you might think it's part of the 60s, but in actual fact it wasn't. Free speech was restricted. On the radio you just didn't hear meaningful lyrics. You heard entertainment. And so radio stations, as Martin knows very well, in Britain would not play popular music until a certain event happened. And that popular music was only played on various radio stations. Radio Luxembourg would play it, and then the newly arrival of pirate radio stations on ships beyond the 3-mile limit around Britain. And that's why you've got the Beatles BBC tapes, and I also have BBC tapes, because they didn't play our records, they invited us down to play live on the radio. But when these pirate ships came, they would play everything and anything. That was part of it. But the actual meaningful lyrics that were entering popular music came essentially both ways. It was the direct folk blues of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and myself, but then the rediscovery by the Beatles of their own history, their own roots music. And you could see it when Bob's influence on John Lennon, when John starts to write in a completely different way.
Some of those influences we started to hear emerged, and by the time of the Rubber Soul and Revolver albums, here was poetry, here was an eclectic mix of music, and you at the same time were going beyond that foolish media misnomer, the Britain's answer to Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
I always felt that Bob was actually America's answer to Donovan, but you were starting to grow as well. You were drawing from an ever broader eclectic range of music, not just folk and the blues roots. Yeah,
and my early albums, which I believe are on vinyl in some of the rooms in the hotel here, when I listen to them now, I see it wasn't later on Sunshine Superman, it was earlier on What's Been Did, or the Fairy Tale album, or the Catch the Wind album, where the development, you can hear it, where I'm trying to dig into the guitar, doing these, I'm trying to get these, especially this one that goes, it was an old blues, but the way I'm playing the guitar, I'm listening to Stones and I'm listening to Buddy Holly, how they're doing it on their records. And I'm listening to the Beatles. And buy you Chevrolet, I'll buy you the Chevrolet. Just give me some of your love. Just give me some of your love. Just give me some of your love. And of course in there was blue beat in the clubs of London with the Jamaican music man, the early beginnings of reggae. So I was picking up this world music, and then at one point I'm doing I think I'm going, "She was just 17, you know what I mean." And I'm playing these chords. Da-da. And so I start going, and I sort of get my jazz thing going in these chords. And I dedicated this song to John and Paul. And it became, "Sunshine came softly through my window today. Could have tried easy, but I've changed my way. When you've made your mind up that you're going to be mine, I tell you right now, any trick in the book now, baby, that I can find." Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul.
You actually subtitled that song, didn't you?
Yeah, for John and Paul. It was a subtitle. Although it doesn't sound at all like any of the Beatles songs of the day, it was just the influence of the way they would play these seventh chords. And I just thought it was great. It was a Latin influence on mine. But I got close to the Stones as well, because the song Sunshine Superman is about Linda Lawrence, who was the first celebrated girlfriend of the first celebrated figure. Before Lennon, there was Brian Jones in the Rolling Stones, and I met Brian. But my river, my tributaries of influence would flow closer and closer into the mainstream, and I would be more and more bonded with the Beatles than the Stones. Yeah.
And there came a lot of social interaction. You started as you were performing in between the times when you'd be on the road, or the Beatles were on the road. You started to interact socially with Paul and George. Tell us a little bit about those moments before fame engulfed everyone and there was no time to see anyone.
Well, there was this. Only in retrospect did I realize it, but there is this time. And they were very famous, and so was I. And they were even more famous and creating more stir than I. But it was in those years of 66 and 7, when life was not so hectic for us, although it was hectic enough, but we were yet to be whooshed into this super fame, which would make life dangerous for them, which would make them withdraw from the world completely of live performance. And still, there was a way to hang out. And apart from George, who I went out to his house in Isha, and we shared common interests. He gave me the autobiography of a yogi, because he was already being drawn into Hinduism. And do you know that book? I saw a few claps over there. Yeah. And then I was giving him the Dhammapada, the Buddhist sutras, and we would make fun of each other, of which was better, Hinduism or Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism came from the root of Hinduism, and we both knew that. But we would have some laughs, and the Liverpool humor that glued those four guys together was a great tonic. And they only kid on the ones they love, you said the other day. And so they were kidding me on all the time, and I loved it. So George and I would have shared interests, of course, in a spiritual path, because I was focusing on that in my private time, well before the Maharishi. And Paul and I found in each other a bond which my wife Linda, by the way, Linda Lawrence, the Sunshine Supergirl, the legend of a girl child, years later we married and we're still together. She is my muse. Yeah. That's a miracle. But Paul and I, Linda pointed out, share an astrological bond, because he's a Gemini and I'm Gemini rising. And so in a Gemini, they're supposed to be the twins, But she said, knowing more about it than I, even the two twins have two things going for them. So there are 4 events happening in the mind of the Gemini all the time. And that's why Paul is so prolific in the songwriting, Linda says, and me too. And we struck up this funny relationship where he would visit me and I would visit him. He lived in St. John's Wood in those still early days when we had time on our hands. And I remember I lived on Edgware Road, not very far from St. John's Wood, and Paul was living with his sweetheart Jane at the time. And he visited one day, and we'd share songwriting. Not that we'd write together, but I'd want to play him my new songs, and he'd want to play me his. Because I really think songwriters work for each other. We want our peers to hear the songs first. We're the first to hear the song, then our peers, and then we want everybody to hear them. And that's the 3 parts of songwriting. So one day I was sitting cross-legged in my little flat in St. John's Wood, in Maida Vale, and Paul was round the corner, and he decided to visit me. And it was a sunny afternoon, a Sunday, and there was no traffic on the Edgware Road, which shows something about the time I'm speaking of. Before, traffic glutted every city in the world. And it was a quiet, sunny afternoon, and I was writing songs cross-legged on my Japanese tatami mat floor. Behind me was a brass bed, a Victorian brass bed. So I kind of got my romantic images mixed up a little bit. A brass bed on tatami mats. Come on, I said to myself when I remembered that. But still, that was me then. And I'm sitting with a little tape recorder writing my new songs diligently. And there's a bell on the door, rings, and I go to it, and it's Paul McCartney. So Paul says, "Hello, Don." I said, "Oh, he called me Philip. My middle name is Phillips." He said, "Hello, Philip." I said, "Hey, Paul." He says, "What you doing?" I said, "I'm writing songs." He said, "So am I. Can I come in?" So he came in, and he had his guitar over his shoulder. And he sat down, and he said, I said, "What have you got?" And he said, "I got this." All in the Tunji, blowing his mind in the dark with a pipe full of clay. What could he say? All in the Tunji. Da 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 da. Sounded a bit jazzy. Da 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 da. Do they all come full in the Tunji? I said, "That sounds good, Paul." Of course, we all know what that song turned into. And often a songwriter just patches together any old bits of words. And this Olin Atunji, whoever he was, with his pipe full of clay. And he said, I sang him one of mine, I think. What was it? I think it was, "How high the gulls fly o'er Islay. How sad the farm lad deep in play. I felt like a tide left me here." So I was working on that. And then he said, "I've got this one. We all live in a yellow submarine, a yellow submarine, yellow submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine." I liked it already. Yellow submarine, yellow submarine. And our friends are all aboard. He was doing this little Spike Milligan voice. Many more of them live next door. Da, da, da. And he went on, and I said, "This is good." He says, "It's like your songs, Don. It's like a children's song." And I said, "Yeah, I love that." And he said, "But I'm missing one of the lines." I said, "Paul McCartney missing one of the lines?" Sure, if Paul fell on a piano, by the time he picked himself up, he'd have written 3 songs. Yes. So he said, "Maybe you could come up with a line." And I felt immediately flattered. I mean, here, what? Okay, right. So, okay. So I went into the bedroom. And then he had we sailed off to the sun till we found the sea of green. Was it that verse? I can't remember. He goes, sky of blue and sea of green in our yellow submarine. That'll do. So I went in and he said, have you got it? I said, here it is, sky of blue, sea of green in our yellow submarine. He said, that'll do. And so that's how I ended up in a Beatles song. Yeah.
If we dare move forward a little in time, because there's so little time and so many stories to share, the spiritual path that you were on, that George was on, led all of you to be in India at the same time.
Yes.
And in that spiritual quest in the spring of 1968, armed with nothing more than your quest for knowledge, spiritual growth, and your trusty acoustic guitars, you'd be sitting there, and there was a musical interchange that went both ways. The tributary and the rivers ran both ways in terms of guitar styles and in terms of lyric writing.
Amazingly so. The protest movement, the meaningful lyrics, the marriage of folk commitment to pop culture had led, I know it led me, and it's obviously it led George and John, and definitely to a certain extent Paul, to the understanding that the world wasn't going to change unless it changed the fundamental nature of the human condition, which was leading the world into so much suffering and chaos. And compassion would have to be born within each soul. It could not be imposed by a protest march. It could not be forced by an act of law. And nobody believed that there'd be a new Messiah arriving. So the change had to be within. And in the books we were reading in our Bohemian days, we'd heard about the words meditation. And that led us to India. But when we arrived there, and people have asked me, what is your most endearing memory? They say, surely the meditation, the personal change, the spiritual path that arrived at, you'd really got a mantra now from a real yogi. I said, no. I think my best memory was that the 3 guitar players of the Beatles didn't have any amplifiers, and they brought 3 acoustic guitars. And so had I. And when George arrived, he just brought in the tablas for Ringo and a sitar for himself and a tambura, which I played sometimes. And so we were sitting around with our acoustic guitars, just writing songs and meditating during the day and writing songs during the early mornings and the evenings. It was an incredible situation. Cut off from our fame, although the media of the world followed us to the ashram and camped outside for 3 whole days. The BBC, the NBC, the French television, the German television, the Japanese television, and the newspapers and the radio. Finally, they went away and left. And what were we doing now? There was vegetarian food, no telephones, no drugs, no drink, no fame anymore. We were plunged into the world that we'd probably left when we were 14, sitting around with guitars and just playing. And that interaction started happening. John watched me do this. He said, what are you doing there? I said, how do you do that finger picking, Don? I said, well, it's a pattern. And because it's moving so fast, you can't see how it's done. But I'll slow it down if you want to learn it. And this interaction was incredible, because I took 3 days to learn this from a guy called Dirty Hugh. He didn't wash, you see. He was one of those, the great unwashed Bohemian. Nobody would go near him. But I saw that he knew what he was doing, and so I had to suffer for my art. But I took 3 days when Hugh showed me. John Lennon took 2 days. It was incredible. It's a pattern. thumb and third finger. Thumb, second finger, third finger, bass. Simple enough to say, but the brain has to be taught to do it. It's like any skill, any motor skill in your body. But even walking is difficult at first. And then a new whole set of songwriting comes. And with new performance skills, one songwriter can go into a completely different world. And the White Album that they made after they returned is awash with the acoustic roots that George said to me later and to the press. There was Donovan that was all over the White Album because he was sitting around playing these folk styles, and we all got back to the acoustics. And it's true. And John wrote some beautiful things. Julia, da, da, da. He wrote Julia. So I'll sing a song of love for Julia. And that was for his mum, of course. And in deep meditation, he was going into his own personal life story, of course. And dear Prudence, won't you come out to play? The sun is bright. The sky is blue, the da so you, dear Prudence. Is that the chords? Won't you come out to play? Yeah.
So amongst all those interactions, time is pressing on, but there's one interaction that is so dear, is that you, of course, were writing as well, and you found that George, no slouch with the words himself, volunteered to lend a hand when he heard something you'd written. And perhaps as our grand finale, to share a little bit of that moment where George threw in a line or two, perhaps to repay the kindness that you'd given to Paul.
Yeah, you know, well, I don't have to tell you guys, he was sort of like the younger one and not the songwriter, which we learned later he very much is the songwriter. But he was kind of in the background in that world, and he did the odd song on the Beatles album, but he was writing himself. And one song in particular which I wrote in India, which came out of the sessions, and the drone of the tambura that I was playing, and George was playing the sitar, and George added a verse to this one, but it didn't make the record. And he said to me when I was doing this, yeah, that sounds good. And there in the bungalows and the roofs of our bungalows, under the tropical stars, peacocks were calling to each other in the jungle. I started to write this. Thrown like a star in my vast sleep, I opened my eyes to take a peep, to find that I was by the sea, gazing with tranquility. 'Tis then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing the songs of love. Then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing the song of love. Then George, he wrote, when truth gets buried deep beneath 1,000 years asleep, time demands a turn around, and once again the truth is found. Yes, George. Yeah. Wow, 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 wow. hurdy-gurdy, he sang. I am the hurdy-gurdy man, and I'm singing the songs of love. Beatles were hurdy-gurdy men, they come singing the songs of love. Hurdy-gurdy, hurdy-gurdy, hurdy-gurdy-gurdy, he sang. Oh, Hare Krishna.
You know, in the towering forest of British music, the two tallest redwoods, the Beatles and Donovan.